I mean, if we think of this as the military is kind of having a vote of confidence in Putin, most of them abstained. And that must absolutely be alarming to him, because we, like him, I think had assumed that the final backstop of his rule was that he had the security forces on his side. That's not necessarily a given in the future. So, I mean, I think it is clear that this war is having an impact on Putin's political position, certainly his standing within the elite as well as within the masses, and the war is affecting the political scene, but the political scene is also absolutely constraining the military effort. So, although at the moment you might say the Russians seem to be dug in well and be able to sort of sustain their position, that the political costs, the economic costs, in the long term especially, ought not to be underestimated.
What is the overall impact so far of this offensive?
What we're seeing is that the Ukrainians are still fighting on a very wide front. It's not like they've yet focused in on that particular salient or whatever. And this helps keep the Russians stretched and pinned. And, we are seeing in the main the Ukrainians being able to push the Russians back bit by bit. But precisely, we're talking about, 100 meters here, a couple of 100 meters there, rather than the sort of dramatic advances we saw, for example, with the Kharkiv offensive in September, October of last year. So, yes, territory is being liberated. Russian forces are pinned, they're taking losses, they're pretty much deployed almost all of their reserves now. So if there is a breakthrough, it's not like they've got spare troops lying around to rush to that place. Admittedly, at the same time, the Ukrainians are fighting on a wide front, they're thinly stretched, and about half of the 10th Corps, which was their operational reserve, particularly heavily equipped with Western kit, about half of that has now actually been sort of dribbled out precisely to support the Ukrainian fighting, but it means they still have half left in stock in case some particular opportunity arises. So there's movement, there's progress. This is not like it's a defeat. It's just simply not the kind of dramatic success that some people, particularly people outside Ukraine, had been talking up earlier in the year. But those boosters who were more or less saying at the beginning of the year, oh, well, thanks to all this new Western technology, the Russians are going to crumble as soon as the Ukrainians come after them. In some ways, they did Ukraine no favors, because that wasn't ever realistic. Instead, we have a counteroffensive which, on the one hand, look, the Ukrainians have been open about this. It has not moved anywhere near as far or as quickly as they had planned or hoped. But that at the same time, we can't just simply say it's failed. Firstly, because it may yet this year, before the heavy rains really start to make it harder, they may well yet have this breakthrough that they're hoping for, particularly in the south, to be able to cut off Crimea, which would absolutely be a game changer. But more to the point, if we're realistic, this war is going to last at least another year, quite possibly rather longer. And if we think of it in those terms, the goal of war is not to take back a certain amount of territory or whatever. It is essentially to deprive your enemy of the will and capacity to resist. And therefore the name of the game is essentially degrading the Russian forces. And that's absolutely what the Ukrainians are doing. They are, for example, blasting Russian supply bases, and they're also destroying all important artillery pieces. Artillery is, after all, the god of war. It is the crucial element here. But they are destroying them at a faster rate than Russia can possibly resupply. And so increasingly the Russians are having to use less effective, older, almost World War II vintage artillery. At the same time as the Ukrainians are becoming more and more modern, as more and more kit is provided, or indeed is built by the Ukrainians themselves. So if we think of it in the long term, if we think of this in terms of, well, okay, where will this leave Ukraine for next year's campaign season? Actually, at that point, the Ukrainians will really have got a 21st century military. They'll have had a whole winter in order to take all this new Western kit and work out exactly not just how they're going to use it on the battlefield, but as part of their kind of wider strategy. And at the same time, yes, of course, the Russians will have used the winter to regroup, to recruit some more soldiers, to build more trenches and minefields and such like. But on balance, a 20th century Russian army is going to be facing a 21st century Ukrainian one. And therefore, if we think long term, actually, yes, this is a little disappointing, but at the same time, in the grand scheme of things, the Ukrainians really are winning. and they're positioning themselves to be in a better position in 2024.
So you talk about the 10th there, there's still half of them held in reserve in terms of manpower and equipment. You hear a lot from the Russian side on this, that Leopard tanks aren't effective, they've been wiped out en masse. That can't be true if they've still got half of this unit largely supplied with Western kit and tanks.
Yeah, I mean, look, of course, the battlefield is a dangerous place. Tanks and other vehicles are going to be lost. And in fact, arguably the most serious loss actually was a number of mine-clearing vehicles. The Ukrainians don't have that many. They can't afford to lose them. But the thing we've seen about Western kit, particularly the Leopard 2, I mean, we haven't yet seen the Challenger 2 really in action. And that'll be an interesting thing, because the Challenger 2 is phenomenally well armed and, above all, well armoured. But the Leopard 2, it's first of all proven a lot more survivable than the Russian, really Soviet era tanks that both sides have been deploying. But perhaps most importantly of all, tanks can be fixed. When Russian tanks get destroyed, on the whole, they tend to suffer catastrophic damage. What we've seen with the Leopards is that in many cases, when they can be got to, they can be towed back, taken back to rear bases, sometimes actually in Poland, and fixed so they're ready once again for the fray. So yes, of course, I mean, again, we have to be careful, because there was a lot of loose talk about how this weapon or that was some kind of a war winner, whether it was the HIMARS rocket or the Leopard 2 tank or whatever. No one piece of kit is going to actually win a war. But it has demonstrated that the quality of build and the design philosophies around Western tanks, are frankly superior to the ones of the Russian tanks they're fighting.
So we mentioned before that there was a lot of expectation in the West, a lot of pressure put on this offensive. How have the West, Europe and America reacted?
Again, I think we have to distinguish between, shall I say, the kind of commentariat, and look, I'm speaking to you as one, so it's not as if I can be too snooty about them, and actually the policy circles and so forth. I think, honestly, most Western policy circles had actually long been rather more sceptical about the hopes of a quick victory. Yes, I mean, they would very much have liked it, for all kinds of reasons, not least the fact that we are, after all, dumping billions of pounds, dollars and euros into Ukraine, between both military assistance and indeed the kind of economic support that is keeping the Ukrainian economy on life support. Every month we're having to come up with that, and no politician couldn't think of other uses for the odd billion quid. But that said, as I said, I think that really their plans had long been worked on the basis that this would be a long-running war. Because after all, we have to remember, even if every Russian soldier is pushed out of every square centimetre of occupied territory, that in itself does not necessarily end the war. It simply moves the front line to the national border. The trouble is that wars are ended by the decision of the losing side. And it would actually therefore require the Russians to think, okay, fair enough, this hasn't worked. As it was, otherwise, Putin could continue to threaten Ukraine in all kinds of other ways, lob rockets and drones over the border, regroup for individual attacks. So, the West has been planning. Yes, again, I think we could have been much more forceful in doing so, particularly in terms of cranking up the kind of industrial production that is needed, not just of things like ammunition, but in some ways one of the unspoken stories for too long was actually barrels of artillery. After a certain point, gun barrels actually begin to wear out and need to be replaced. And there is a dearth of production facilities of that, which is now slowly being addressed. So I think that in the West, in policy circles, there is a rather kind of glum acceptance, I think, that this is going to go on. They will happily see if there's any kind of, way of shortening it, great. But otherwise it's there. The big imponderable is the United States, where the prospect potentially of a Donald Trump presidency is alarming a lot of people in America and indeed in Ukraine and in Europe. And certainly, having spoken to a number of people who are officials directly involved in this process in Washington, their view is that there is a real imperative to, if not have won the war by the time a potential Trump presidency begins, but at least to have made it in such a situation that there's no real question but that Ukraine will win. There's a sense that Donald Trump only backs winners, or people he thinks are winners. So that if he can be convinced that Ukraine are the winners, then maybe things will be fine. So there is that kind of potential hurdle. But other than that, essentially, I think this is a case in which Western countries that feared this would be a long-term war are now glumly realizing that it will indeed be that. Meanwhile, those of us in the commentariat, some of us are still predicting that there'll be a grand victory next Wednesday, some of us not, but we are by nature rather more excitable.
I think I would like to come back to Trump if we have the time later on, but we have on the international stage as well now had these peace talks, maybe not to end the war necessarily, but certainly discussions. No Russia invited, but several sort of Russian, perhaps sympathetic nations, or those that were sat on the fence, not least China. How important are those talks?
In and of themselves, one could say that these talks were entirely pointless. They were essentially a performative exercise, as lots of people wanted to show just how much they cared. Akin to wearing a particular coloured wristband or similar. Or in other cases, countries that see themselves in the future as being the potential brokers of peace, and because they think it's going to be in their interests, and here I'm thinking particularly of Turkey, Saudi Arabia and China, wanting to basically maintain some kind of traction on the progress. I mean, given that Russia wasn't invited, of course this wasn't going to be the basis for any kind of real peace talks. And I must admit, as I said, a lot of what came out of Jeddah was really not particularly edifying. There will be working groups, there will be documents, that's fine. But at the moment, neither Kyiv nor Moscow actually have any serious interest in talks, because both of them believe that in fact they will be in a much stronger position for talks at some point in the future. From the Ukrainians' point of view, they think that at present, frankly, they would just simply be giving Russia an opportunity to regroup. If there was any kind of ceasefire for talks or whatever, they want to be in a position in which they've really got Putin's attention. And if, for example, they can break through the lines, break the so-called land bridge that connects mainland Russia to Crimea, and so in effect they're actually besieging Crimea. And we've got to realise that the rest of Ukraine, from most Russians' point of view, they don't really care that much about it. They accept it's a foreign country. Crimea is something that pretty much every Russian, whether or not they're supporters of Putin, think is rightfully Russian anyway. So if they can threaten that, then they feel they might be in a position to really, as it were, have grabbed Putin's attention and force him to make some kind of a deal. And likewise, so long as Putin thinks that in fact they're going to weather this offensive and that maybe the West will start to get lukewarm on supporting Ukraine and will start to try and bring pressure to bear on Ukraine to make a deal, then from Putin's point of view, that's the time to be making peace. So, no one's really talking peace at the moment. This is really just about kind of laying the groundwork for countries like China, who interestingly went to this summit and left saying, well, we agreed with some things, we disagree with others, which doesn't really get us anywhere. But the point is, these are countries which are still waiting for their moment. Again, they're not going to spend political capital trying to create peace unless they think it's likely to work. So in some ways, they are the people we need to be watching. The point at which they start to get serious about presenting themselves as the peace brokers, that's the point when we think that they've had some kind of signal, particularly from Moscow, that actually maybe Putin is finally willing to have talks that matter.
Mm-hmm. And do you think, Ukraine's aim at the moment does still seem to be to get back to those 1991 borders? That's still their aim, surely, despite these peace talks. And what role do you think Crimea plays in that?
Well, look, at present, absolutely, the official position of the Ukrainian government and, frankly, the majority of the Ukrainian people by a long margin is absolutely that all occupied territories have to be returned. That said, who knows what happens further down the line? I mean, we have to recognise that the cost of this war to Ukraine is truly catastrophic. And increasingly, there's a beginnings, and I should stress that, only the beginnings of war weariness on the part of Ukrainians. I was hearing from someone who works in Kyiv yesterday, in fact, that precisely the days when you had lots of volunteers willing to sign up are pretty much over, and increasingly what we're seeing is conscription, and often quite heavy-handed conscription to fill the ranks of the military. So, there is a point where we have to realise that even the Ukrainians will potentially feel the need to make some kind of concessions. And certainly the perspective which you'll find in Washington, but also I would suggest in Berlin and maybe Paris, is that precisely Crimea ultimately will have to be the focus for any kind of peace talks. If there's one thing that Ukraine could give, it is some kind of movement on Crimea. And I'm not saying just simply give Crimea to the Russians, but for example, hold out the possibility of a new and genuine referendum on Crimea's future. Remember, Russia held one in 2014 after it had just already seized the peninsula, and clearly it was held under the Russian gun. Although actually probably a majority of Crimeans would have supported joining Russia genuinely, but still, that was a rigged vote. Maybe there needs to be a new vote carried out under international auspices, which only includes those people who would have been entitled to vote in 2014, because there's been about 1 million Russian colonists arrived since then. Something like that, maybe. And I think, my experience of talking to people in the Ukrainian government is that it's not entirely impossible that at some point there may be a deal. But at the moment, no one can really talk about it. It's too politically explosive. And there is that sense that if Ukraine admits that this is a possibility now, the Russians will kind of take that as read and be trying to push for more. The Russians tend to be very hard-nosed negotiators. So they want to save that as maybe their one keynote concession in the future.
And so what do you think Ukraine's plan is from the position they're in right now?
Well, clearly they're not going to give up hope of being able to make some kind of substantive breakthrough. And it is quite clear at the moment that although they're still fighting along a very broad front, one of the areas of particular focus at the present is Orkhiv, which would be the sort of the key route down to, if you're basically trying to cut down to the Sea of Azov, the Black Sea, and break that land bridge. Of course, they've not given up on that, and as I said, they do still have a chance of doing that. They still have half of this 10th Corps ready to exploit any kind of breakthrough. So in some ways, that's Plan A. But of course, they're not putting everything into Plan A. They're still very much pushing about, well, how can they prepare themselves for next year's offensives? This is one of the reasons why, for example, they haven't slackened their pressure for wanting F-16 fighter aircraft. A key thing that they lack is the capacity to basically contest the skies properly against the Russians, who haven't used their air power at all as effectively as they should, but still nonetheless have a considerable capacity there. So, their view is, in a way, yes, of course, they're not going to get F-16s in time for this campaign season, because you've got to train the pilots, you've got to train the maintenance crews, and then you've actually got to get the planes. But they're pushing now precisely with the hope that come spring, they will have F-16s in the air in support of their ground operation. So they too, I think, are adopting a kind of this two-strand approach. Hope for a quick victory, plan for a long war.
And so the Russians seem to believe they can dig in Ukraine, as you said before. How is that going to be impacted by what Putin is facing on the home front over the next few months and years?
It's interesting that Putin is actually looking a lot less confident in some ways. Militarily, he's still exuding a certain amount of confidence because the Russians still are largely holding the line. The defences have proven very effective. Politically, especially since the mutiny by Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner mercenary company, he's actually been looking rather less confident. Particularly, we're actually now seeing him campaigning. Next year, after all, he stands for re-election, and if you want my little sort of sneak preview, I think he's going to win. But the point is, he wants a truly massive, demonstrative victory. They're even talking about an 80% vote in his favour, which will be larger than previous rigged elections. So we've seen Putin, or potentially a body double, out there pressing the flesh, actually amidst his own people, in a way that we haven't seen for a long time. Really, we haven't seen this properly since before COVID. So, now Putin is moving into kind of campaign mode. But that said, he's clearly worried about the political consequences of the war. The generals have been pushing for some time for another wave of mobilizations, bringing more reservists back into service, because they know that not only are they suffering casualties now, they'll suffer more casualties, And it takes time to get your reservist who may be, I don't know, a 30-year-old bus driver or a 40-year-old oncologist who did national service a long time back, and get them trained up, integrated into their units and so forth. That was one of the problems they had with the previous wave. It was done in September and October. They didn't have a proper chance to train them up before they were actually being used in battle, so a lot of them suffered the consequences. So that's what the military wanted. That's not what's happening. In September, there are going to be local elections. And when I say local elections, with our British sort of perspective, we think of local elections as something small and cosy. I mean, these are actually to governors of Russian regions, some of which are larger than all of Britain put together. So, these are substantial elections. And it seems to be that Putin is not willing to hold the next mobilization, knowing that it'll be politically very unpopular, until after those elections. I mean, we'll see if he holds the line, but at the moment that seems to be very much the case. So again, we're seeing that actually militarily relevant decisions are actually being sort of put aside in favour of domestic politics. This is not a man who feels anywhere near as confident about his control over the country as he would like to make out. And given that when Prigozhin launched his mutiny, most of the Russian troops and security forces who are around in the areas where Prigozhin was operating and his forces were moving towards Moscow, they didn't join Prigozhin, which is what Prigozhin had anticipated. He said, half the army will join me. Well, that didn't. I think there was like 70 guys who did. But nor did they show any enthusiasm to stop Prigozhin. I mean, if we think of this as the military is kind of having a vote of confidence in Putin, most of them abstained. And that must absolutely be alarming to him, because we, like him, I think had assumed that the final backstop of his rule was that he had the security forces on his side. That's not necessarily a given in the future. So, I mean, I think it is clear that this war is having an impact on Putin's political position, certainly his standing within the elite as well as within the masses, and the war is affecting the political scene, but the political scene is also absolutely constraining the military effort. So although at the moment you might say the Russians seem to be dug in well and be able to sort of sustain their position, that the political costs, the economic costs, in the long term especially, ought not to be underestimated.
So presumably that home front issue for Putin is something that the West and Europe and NATO are going to watch very, very closely, because I think a lot of people with cost of living are going to be asking, how long can the West support Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, that's perfectly true. I mean, from this point of view, I mean, this war could never have happened at a good time. It's a terrible, terrible thing. But economically, it's happened at a particularly bad time for us, and also politically. I mean, after all, America is not the only country that's going to be having elections next year. And although in the UK there is pretty much a cross-party consensus, I mean, if anything, when the opposition pipes up about Ukraine, it's usually about complaining that more is not being done. That certainly isn't the case in the United States, and it's certainly not necessarily the case in many European countries. I mean, to be brutally honest, so long as America is committed to supporting Ukraine and this sort of, in effect, two-pronged war. I mean, there is a shooting war that's happening inside Ukraine, and the West is really in an economic and political war with Russia sort of in parallel. So long as America, which provides the lion's share of the military and economic assistance, is committed, then I think in a way the rest of the alliance will continue to follow along, even if some countries are a little reluctant. Not least because American sanctions on Russia mean that if a Western country wanted to trade in, say, microchips or whatever, it would find itself under American secondary sanctions. So no one really wants that. So on one level, actually, the situation is much safer for Ukraine than might otherwise look. But we also have to recognise that Ukraine fatigue is a real thing. And I was very struck by Ben Wallace's exasperation when he said, look, we're not Amazon. And look, no one can say that Ben Wallace has not been a truly steadfast supporter of Ukraine, and very, very strongly committed to continuing to see that Ukraine has the wherewithal it needs. When you even got someone like Ben Wallace saying, basically, look, Ukraine, you need to be thinking more about the political context of the countries that you're expecting aid from. I think that was an attempt, frankly, as a friend, to give Ukraine a warning that they shouldn't take this for granted. What I fear is not that there's going to be some mass surrender, shall we say. It's rather that in some capitals, and they tend to be larger European countries' capitals, you're going to get more behind the scenes pressure on Ukraine to say, come on, you need to start talking to the Russians. You need to be thinking in terms of what kind of offer you're going to give them. Precisely because in some ways they want Ukraine to make their lives easier. And although I think at the moment the Ukrainians seem frankly bloody-minded enough to resist any such pressure, there comes a point when that might sort of step in when Ukraine needs more assistance. Because I think this is what we've got to realise. There's a tension. Ukraine always wants more tomorrow, and that's understandable. They're fighting for their survival as a sovereign nation. But on the other hand, this is not just a quick sprint to victory. This is, to use the cliche, a marathon. And the risk is that, in fact, if too much is promised now, there won't be the wherewithal, whether it's in terms of just, more equipment or ammunition or spare parts or whatever else is needed to maintain that commitment. And I think we might find countries beginning to try and backslide a bit, to say, look, we've got no more spare tanks, we've got no more spare artillery. We're already really coming to that point, frankly. And if a country is beginning to feel the pinch, it's going to be that much quicker. In some ways, it's going to set the bar at a different place and actually say, no, we thought we needed 30 tanks, but actually we need 50. And so we haven't got any more to give. So I think we have to acknowledge, it's a very long and rambling answer, I apologise. We have to acknowledge that this is an issue, but it's not quite so straightforward as that countries are going to say, that's it, we've had enough, Ukraine, fend for yourself. It's that the willingness to find new ways of supporting Ukraine will increasingly, I think, become overstretched.
How would American tanks and fighter jets change things? We've heard they've been coming down the pipe, so to speak, for quite some time now.
Yeah, I'm not, as I said, no one piece of kit or even two pieces of kit are kind of war winners in and of themselves. The Abrams tank is a very, very sort of effective, if fuel guzzling piece of kit. It obviously provides the Ukrainians with greater sort of protected mobility. In other words, the opportunity to punch through Russian lines all the more easily. But on the other hand, its tank treads can be blown off by a sort of sufficiently large Russian mine as easily as anything else. All of this incrementally increases Ukraine's capacities to be able to fight a kind of Western-style, modern, fluid maneuver war. But we shouldn't assume that it's suddenly going to change the arithmetic of the battlefield.
Mark Galeotti, thank you very much for your time today.
Pleasure.